Okay, let's continue on with our modern poets. The last group that we did were the imagists. Remember, who just like wanted to take a snapshot image and describe something in as few words as possible, as distinctly as possible. Ezra Pound, William Carlos Williams, H.D., and Archibald MacLeish. Today we're going to look at T.S. Eliot. Open your books to page 465. I posted a YouTube video of Eliot, reading this poem, The Journey of the Magi, himself. So listen to him read it, and then we'll answer the questions. Let me just point out a couple of things on his biography on page 469, that for the first good portion of his life, he was not a Christian, but he became a Christian. He converted later on in his life, and after this, his works became more religious. And by the way, this man, let's see, he was educated all over the world. He won what prizes? Where is it? Oh, the Nobel Prize for Literature, Great Britain's highest award, the Order of Merit. So he's not just any old poet wandering around, okay? So later in his life, he became a Christian, and he started writing from a religious perspective. And then, of course, the critics didn't quite give him quite the credence that they used to, but his poems were still very, very well received. Look at the very last sentence about T.S. Eliot. Like many of them, the modern poets, he records modern ills, pessimistic melancholy. But unlike them, he diagnoses these ills and prescribes a remedy, a return to Christianity. As we look at this poem, we're going to see that it is a dramatic monologue. That is one of the terms that you should know from this unit. A lyric poem in which a character, not the author, the character of the poem is speaking to a silent audience about a critical moment in his life. Remember, like, what was the dramatic monologue we read by Robert Browning? Oh, My Last Duchess. Remember that in 10th grade lit? This is a dramatic monologue in which Lewis Eliot is speaking. Excuse me, I'm looking at the Bible verse real quick. Joshua 7:24. Because the next verse, the next word I want to point out is polysyndeton. Polysyndeton is the repetition of coordinating conjunctions, especially and. So we'll see an example of this in this poem. I just wanted to read a Bible verse. And Joshua and all Israel with him took Achan, the son of Zerah, and the silver and the garment and the wedge of gold, and his sons and his daughters and his oxen and his asses and his sheep and his tent and all that he had. And they brought them into the valley of Achor. Just showing you a good example of polysyndeton. We will see it in this poem as well. I did not point out symbols and biblical allusions because you should know those already. So, listen to the poem, Journey of the Magi. There's a great painting on page 470 that kind of goes along with this poem. Now look at the questions. I'm going to go through these quickly so that you have an understanding of the poem. Where in the first stanza does polysyndeton occur? And how does this rhetorical figure reinforce the speaker's assessment of the journey? Well, if you look in lines 12 down through 16 or 17, then the camel men, cursing and grumbling and running away and wanting their liquor and women, and the night fires going out, and the lack of shelters, and the cities hostile, and the towns unfriendly, and the villages dirty, and charging high prices. A hard time we had of it. That's a good example of polysyndeton. The repetition of and to add on new hardships kind of piles on and overwhelms the reader, just like the Magi were overwhelmed by it. By the way, who are the Magi? They're the wise men who came to seek the Christ child, right? So, explain the symbolism of the poem's title, The Journey of the Magi. Yes, he's talking about a physical journey that he took with these men to find the Christ child, but he's also symbolically talking about the journey in his life, the transformation of his life, not just a literal journey, but a spiritual journey. Question 3, identify the two allusions in line 27 to the events surrounding Christ's crucifixion. Line 27, 6 hands at an open door dicing for pieces of silver. 6 hands dicing alludes to the soldiers casting lots for Christ's garments. And then pieces of silver, of course, references Judah's betrayal of Christ for 30 pieces of silver. Question 4, describe the poem's speaker by answering the journalistic questions. What critical moment is he relating? He's relating his travel to see the newborn Christ. What is his assessment of the journey? He says that it's difficult, and at the time he thought it was a foolish idea or whatever, yet at the end of the story he says he would do it again. How does the climate change during the journey? Well, it starts with a very dead of winter and melting snow or whatever, and then it changes to a more temperate climate, the verdant valley, the place of life. So he's going from death, symbolizing the snow and the cold and the winter, and then the spring and the summer, new life. Paradoxical statement about birth and death in the last stanza. We are talking about the new birth here. The speaker witnessed Christ's birth, and that brought on his spiritual birth. And that then at the end it says, I should be glad of another death. You're talking about Christ's death, and that his death. You know, of course, as a Christian, you have to die to self and the things of this world, but also when you die, you will have what? New life, eternal life. Why does the speaker describe his relatives and countrymen as alien people? Well, their values are now strange and foreign to him because of his inner change. And then number 8, which interpretation from the evaluate section, that's over here on page 469, it talks about the way unsaved people interpret this poem and the way Christians interpret this poem. So you might want to read over that and see which one you agree with, which interpretation of the poem that you agree with. All right, of course you have to understand the Christian doctrine, and you have to believe, of course, that he transformed his life. He didn't transform his life. He got saved and his life was transformed. So, this poem is a little bit more complex, but it's nothing that we can't handle and understand. T.S. Eliot, The Journey of the Magi.